The pie tin sat on Minnie Harper's kitchen table for 11 days before she finally worked up the nerve to return it. It was not a complicated thing, returning a pie tin. A woman walked next door, knocked on the door, handed it over, said thank you, and walked back home. Simple as sunrise. Simple as the creek that ran behind the row of modest homesteads on the western edge of Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1882. And yet for 11 days Minnie had found reason after reason to delay. The morning was too cold, the afternoon too busy, the evening too dark. The tin needed one more rinse. The tin needed to dry fully. The tin was fine, but she herself was not yet ready. She was never ready when it came to Cyrus Doyle. The truth of it, if she were honest with herself while standing at her kitchen window, watching the pale gold light slide across his fence posts in the early morning, was that she had not been ready for 3 years. Not since the day she had moved into the little white clapboard house beside his, a widow woman with a daughter and a small inheritance, and a determination to begin again somewhere the air did not taste like grief. She had arrived in June of 1879 with a wagon full of furniture and a heart full of carefully constructed resolve. And the man next door had stepped out onto his porch to watch the wagon pull up, had tipped his hat with that particular slow economy of motion that certain men possess, had met her eyes for exactly one unguarded second, and had then spent the next 3 years doing everything within his considerable power to make certain it never happened again. He was not rude. That was the confounding thing. Cyrus Doyle was never rude. He nodded when he saw her at the general store. He moved aside on the boardwalk without being asked. When her fence line needed mending after the late winter of 1880 sent a tree branch crashing through it, she had come outside to find the break already repaired. No note, no knock, just new wood where the broken wood had been. When a grass fire had threatened the south edge of her property the following summer, he had been out there with a wet sack beating it back before she had even found her own sack. He was present in every practical emergency and entirely absent in every other way. And for 3 years Minnie Harper had told herself that was perfectly fine, that she preferred it, that she had enough to manage with her daughter Clara and her chickens and her small kitchen garden and her work taking and mending for the town's better-dressed citizens. She had told herself this so many times that she had very nearly believed it. Clara was the one who had baked the pie. She was 14 now, tall and serious and considerably more observant than her mother generally credited, and she had produced a perfect apple pie on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks prior, and announced that it was for Mr. Doyle because he had repaired the gate latch without being asked, and that deserved acknowledgement. Minnie had said that was very thoughtful and had carried the pie over herself, because the idea of Clara standing on that man's porch knocking on his door was somehow more difficult to manage than doing it herself. She had knocked. She had stood there on his porch boards with the pie covered in a clean cloth, and she had listened to the silence inside for a long moment before he appeared in the doorway. He had looked at the pie. He had looked at her. Something had crossed his face too quickly to name. "Clara made it," Minnie said. "Apple, we had a good harvest this year." "Tell her thank you," he said. His voice was low and careful, the voice of a man who chose his words the way other men chose their tools for specific purpose, nothing extraneous. "I will," she said, and handed him the pie and walked home. And that was that, except that the tin had been sitting on her table for 11 days because she had not managed to walk back over and retrieve it. On the 12th morning she picked it up. The air smelled of wood smoke and dried grass, and the faint, distant possibility of early snow. The cottonwood trees along the creek had gone entirely yellow, and some of them had already let their leaves go, and the ground was layered in gold where she walked the 20 steps between her gate and his. She had not rehearsed what she would say. She had decided not to rehearse because every time she rehearsed, she found 11 more reasons to delay. She knocked. The silence inside was the same quality of silence as the last time, thick and inhabited, the silence of a man who had heard the knock and was deciding something. Then she heard his boots on the floorboards, that particular measured tread, and the door opened. He was in his work clothes, canvas pants and a collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows despite the chill, and he had clearly been in the middle of something, because there was sawdust on his forearm and a small cut on his left hand that he had wrapped loosely in a strip of cloth. He was 34 years old, lean in the way that men who work with their hands and spend their days under open sky become lean, with dark hair that had grown a little long at the collar and gray eyes that were the color of the sky just before weather arrived. He looked at her, and then at the tin in her hands, and then at her again. "Returning your tin," she said. "Right," he said. He took the tin. He did not step back from the doorway. She did not step back from the porch. There was a moment that stretched out between them like taffy being pulled, elastic and improbable, and neither of them seemed to know what to do with it. "Your hand," she said, because she had to say something, and that was what presented itself. He looked down at the wrapped cloth as though he had forgotten it was there. Chisel slipped. "Is it deep?" "Not very. I have calendula salve," she said. "Clara makes it. She is very good at it. I am sure I am fine." "You are probably fine," Minnie agreed, "but the cut could still benefit from proper attention." He looked at her steadily for a moment. There was something happening behind those gray eyes, some kind of internal argument she was not privy to, and she felt the absurdity of the situation settle over her. Two grown people standing in a doorway arguing quietly about a small cut on a hand, both of them knowing perfectly well that the cut was not what they were arguing about at all. "I would not want to trouble you," he said finally. "It is no trouble," she said. "I was going to make coffee anyway." That was a lie. She had already had her coffee that morning and was not planning to make more. But something had happened in that stretched-out moment. Something had shifted, and she was not willing to let it close back up again without at least trying to see what was on the other side. He stood in the doorway for what felt like a very long time. The autumn wind moved through the cottonwoods and sent a small cascade of yellow leaves spinning past his fence posts, and a crow called from somewhere far away, and Minnie Harper held her breath without quite realizing she was doing it. "All right," he said. He said it simply, the way a man says a thing he has been holding back for a long time says it when he finally decides to put it down. She went home and found the calendula salve and made fresh coffee, and tried to pretend that her hands were not trembling very slightly as she set the cups on the table. He knocked on her door 4 minutes later. She had counted. He came inside with his hat in his hand and stood in her kitchen with the particular careful posture of a man who was very aware of being somewhere he was not entirely sure he was supposed to be. Her kitchen was warm and smelled of the coffee, and of the dried herbs she kept hanging from the ceiling beams, lavender and rosemary, and the calendula flowers Clara had harvested in August. There were Clara's drawings pinned to the wall beside the window and a pair of boots by the door that were too small to be anyone's but her daughter's. It was a domestic space, fully and warmly inhabited, and he looked around at once with an expression that Minnie could not quite classify. "Sit down," she said, and gestured to the chair at the kitchen table. He sat. She sat across from him and opened the tin of salve and unwound the makeshift bandage from his hand. The cut was on the heel of his palm, not terribly deep but long, and it had not been properly cleaned. She did not comment on this. She went to the basin and dampened a cloth and came back and cleaned it carefully while he held very still and looked at the table. "This must sting," she said. "Some," he agreed. "You should have come over sooner." "I managed." "I can see that," she said, in a tone that made it clear she could also see that he had not managed especially well. She heard the small sound he made, not quite a laugh, the ghost of one, immediately suppressed, and she felt something warm move through her chest. She applied the salve and bandaged the hand properly with a strip of clean linen, and tied it off neatly. When she was done, she looked up and found him looking at her, and for the second time she experienced that sensation of being seen too directly, too fully, by eyes that were the color of incoming weather. "Thank you," he said. "Coffee," she said, because she needed to look at something other than his face, and she got up and poured 2 cups and set one in front of him and wrapped her hands around her own. For a moment they sat in silence, but it was a different quality of silence than the one in his doorway. This one had some give in it. "Clara is at school?" he asked. "Until 3 o'clock, she said. She is doing very well this year. She wants to be a schoolteacher herself eventually." "That is good," he said. He turned his coffee cup slightly in his unbandaged hand. "She is a good girl, smart." "She is," Minnie said, and there was so much tenderness in those two words that she heard it herself and felt suddenly exposed by it, the way a person feels exposed when they are caught being tender when they thought they were being practical. "How long have you been widowed?" he asked. The question surprised her. Not because it was inappropriate. It was a perfectly reasonable question, the kind that neighbors exchanged all the time, but because he had never asked it. In 3 years he had never asked her a single personal question, and now he was asking one, and the asking of it felt like a door opening in a wall she had assumed was solid. 4 years, she said. Robert died in the spring of 1878, fever. It came on very fast. "I am sorry," he said, and it was said with the plainness of a man who means exactly what he says, nothing performative about it. "He was a good man," she said. "A good father. We were well suited, Robert and I. He would have liked Caldwell, I think. He liked small towns." She paused. "What about you? You were married." It was the thing that everyone in Caldwell knew about Cyrus Doyle, or rather the piece of it that everyone knew, that he had been married and was no longer. The details were vague and variously reported depending on who one asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. 7 years ago. Her name was Ellen. She died in childbirth." He paused, the pause of a man carefully navigating terrain he knows to be difficult. "The child did not survive either." "I am very sorry," Minnie said. "It was a long time ago," he said, which was what people said when they meant that the sharpest part of a grief had finally worn down enough to be carried without cutting, though the carrying never entirely stopped. She looked at him across her kitchen table in the autumn morning light, this man she had lived beside for 3 years and known not at all, and she felt something she had not expected to feel: recognition. Not of him specifically, though there was that too, some strange and inexplicable sense of recognition that she had felt the first time he met her eyes, and that had not gone away even through 3 years of careful distance, but of the particular quality of his solitude. The way a person builds a life after loss, the way the architecture of it can look from the outside like preference. "You have been very alone," she said, and she did not say it with pity, which would have been wrong, but with the quiet acknowledgment of someone who understood the condition. He did not deny it. He looked at his coffee cup. "It seemed simpler," he said. "I know," she said. The morning light shifted as a cloud moved across the sun and then back, and the kitchen went briefly golden and came back to its ordinary warmth, and neither of them spoke for a little while. It was, Minnie realized, the most peaceful she had felt in a very long time, which made no particular sense and made perfect sense simultaneously. "Your fence on the east side needs attention," he said finally, apparently feeling that the conversation had reached a sufficient depth and requiring practical ground. "I know," she said. "I have been meaning to get to it. I can take a look." "You do not have to do that." "I know I do not have to," he said, and met her eyes, and this time neither of them looked away immediately. "I would like to." She held his gaze and felt that warm movement in her chest again, steadier this time, less startling, more like the recognition of something that had been there all along. "All right," she said. She said it simply. The way a person says a thing they have been holding back for a long time says it when they finally decide to put it down. He came back that afternoon with his tools and worked on the fence while she worked in her garden pulling up the last of the season's growth, and they did not speak much, but they were aware of each other with a new and particular awareness. The way people are aware of one another when something has changed between them, and neither one quite knows yet what to do with the change. Clara came home from school at 3 o'clock, walked through the gate, observed the situation with the calm assessment of a 14-year-old who has been paying close attention for considerably longer than adults generally realize, and said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Doyle. with a politeness that Minnie recognized as strategic. "Miss Clara," he said, and tipped his hat, and something in Clara's expression settled into satisfaction. That night after Clara was in bed, Minnie sat at her kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea and thought about gray eyes and the careful way a man holds himself when he is trying very hard not to want something. And she thought about 3 years of careful distance. And she thought about the way he had said, "I would like to," as though the admission itself cost him something, and he was choosing to spend the cost anyway. She went asleep thinking about that, and she dreamed of the cottonwood trees along the creek, all yellow and letting go. The autumn deepened. The days grew shorter and the nights came down cold and blue, and Caldwell, Kansas settled into the particular rhythm of a cattle town in the off-season. The big drives finished, the money mostly spent, the saloon still occupied but with a different character, local men and permanent residents rather than the seasonal tide of trail hands. The streets were quieter. The sky seemed larger somehow, now that the town was not full of sound and dust and motion. Cyrus Doyle found reasons to be visible. He had spent 3 years being invisible when it came to Minnie Harper, and he found now that the habit was dissolving with a speed that alarmed him slightly. He could not seem to maintain the careful discipline of avoidance that had served him, or that he had told himself had served him for so long. He came over to look at the east fence, and while he was looking at it he found that the gate post on the north side also needed attention. And while he was attending to that, he noticed a board on her porch was soft and beginning to go. And while he was thinking about the porch board, she came out with a cup of coffee and handed it to him without being asked. And he stood there with the coffee in his hand looking at her, and she looked back. And the autumn light was doing something entirely unreasonable to the color of her hair. Minnie Harper was 31 years old and had a quality that Cyrus found himself unable to satisfactorily name. She was not spectacular in the way that sometimes strikes men like lightning. She was something quieter than that, something more in the way of a fire built properly in a well-made hearth, steady and warm and eminently real. She had brown eyes and a manner of speaking that was direct without being sharp, and she laughed easily when something genuinely struck her as funny, and she had opinions about things and was not afraid to express them while remaining genuinely curious about the opinions of others. She was competent in a way that he respected, managing her household and her daughter and her small business without apparent distress, and beneath the competence was something softer that she did not advertise but that he noticed nonetheless: a tenderness, a susceptibility to beauty, a capacity for feeling things deeply that she had learned to carry quietly. He had noticed all of this over 3 years of avoidance. This was the problem with avoidance as a strategy. It required attention. He had spent 3 years attending to her from a careful distance and learning more about her than he had intended to know, and now that the distance had collapsed somewhat, now that he had sat at her kitchen table and drunk her coffee and let her bandage his hand, he did not know what to do with all that accumulated knowing. He came over to work on the porch board on a Thursday morning and ended up staying for lunch because Clara, who had apparently decided that her mother needed management, announced that there was enough soup for 3 people and set a third bowl on the table before either adult could object. He sat across from Minnie at the table again and ate the soup, which was very good, and listened to Clara describe the history lesson her teacher had given that morning about the settlement of the Western Territories, a subject on which Clara had well-developed views regarding the treatment of the native peoples who had lived there long before any settlers arrived. "It is not right," Clara said, with the absolute moral clarity of a 14-year-old who has thought about something carefully. "The Comanche, the Cheyenne, all of them, they were here first, and what has been done to them is a terrible injustice." My teacher tried to explain it as progress, but I do not think progress that requires that much suffering can be called progress with a straight face. Cyrus found himself looking at the girl with considerable respect. "Your teacher is not wrong that it is complicated," he said carefully. "But you are not wrong either. I have known men who traded with the Cheyenne good men on both sides, and what has happened on the reservations is something I do not think history will look back on kindly." Clara looked at him as though she was recalibrating something. "You have known Cheyenne people." "I spent 2 years in Colorado before I came to Kansas," he said. "There were families there. They were people the same as anyone, with the same," he paused, choosing words carefully, "the same love of their children and their land and their way of doing things. What was done to them was wrong. I think it was wrong at the time, and I think it will be understood as wrong for as long as there is anyone to understand things." He had not meant to say that much. He glanced at Minnie, who was watching him with that expression. He was beginning to recognize the one where she looked as though she was seeing something she had suspected was there, but was gratified to have confirmed. "I agree with you entirely," she said quietly. Clara looked between them with the satisfaction of a person who has engineered a successful outcome. "More soup?" she asked. After lunch, Cyrus finished the porch board and went home and stood in his own kitchen, which was considerably more spare than Minnie's, furnished with function and nothing much beyond it, and thought about the fact that he had just had lunch with his neighbor and her daughter, and had discussed the moral dimensions of westward expansion, and had felt, for the duration of it, more genuinely present in the world than he had felt in a very long time. He was not sure what to do with that. He was sure of one thing, which was that Ellen had been dead for 7 years and he had been 27 years old when he lost her, and he was 34 now, and he had told himself that the closed quality of his life was a choice he had made deliberately and maintained deliberately. But sitting in that kitchen this morning, he had understood with uncomfortable clarity that it had not been a choice at all. It had been a response. A response to pain, a drawing in, a making small of the space he occupied so that less of him was exposed to the weather. And the weather, of course, had come anyway, in the form of a widow woman with brown eyes who baked, or whose daughter baked apple pie, and who had an opinion about everything, and who had, apparently, been waiting with something like patience for him to stop being a fool. He was not entirely sure she had been waiting. He was possibly projecting. But he thought about the way she had said "all right" when he said he would like to look at the fence, and the way she had come out with the coffee without being asked, and the way she had looked at him across the table that first morning, direct and steady, and without any particular agenda that he could identify beyond the one that was simply two people being honest with each other, and he thought, "She has been waiting." The question was what he intended to do about it. He went to town the following Friday for supplies. The general store in Caldwell was run by a man named Pete Harwick who knew everything that happened in the county and was generally not shy about sharing it. And while Cyrus was selecting a length of rope, Pete said conversationally, "Noticed you've been doing some work over at the Harper place." And Cyrus said, "Her fence needed attention." And Pete said, "Sure did," in a tone that communicated perfectly clearly that he was not actually talking about the fence. Caldwell in 1882 was a proper town incorporated, with a marshal's office, a school, 2 churches, a doctor, a newspaper, and enough established families that the social architecture of it was fairly well developed. It had been a wild place in its earlier days, the end of the Kisham Trail, and some of that wildness still inhabited the edges, but the center of it had solidified into something resembling a proper community. People knew each other. People talked. Minnie Harper was well liked. She was known as sensible and kind, as someone who helped neighbors when they needed help and did not make a production of it, as a woman who had made a solid life for herself and her daughter after genuine hardship. Cyrus Doyle was known as capable and solitary, and not given to much social interaction beyond what the town required of him, which was not a great deal. They were an unlikely pair in terms of temperament, though perhaps not in terms of circumstances, and Cyrus was aware as he collected his supplies and listened to Pete Harwick not quite ask his intentions that the town had noticed something even if the town was not yet sure what it was noticing. He stopped at the dry goods section and considered a length of blue ribbon that was sitting on the counter beside the thread display. He stood there looking at it for longer than was reasonable. It was a very ordinary length of blue ribbon, the kind used to trim a dress or a hat or Clara's braids. He thought of Minnie's brown hair in the autumn morning light. He bought the ribbon and put it in his pocket and felt immediately ridiculous about it. He went back by way of the creek road, and as he came up the hill toward the row of homesteads, he saw smoke coming from Minnie's chimney in a comfortable column against the autumn sky, and the sight of it did something to him that he had no adequate language for. He stopped at his own gate. He thought about the ribbon in his pocket. He thought about Ellen, the way he always thought about Ellen when he was about to do something that felt like moving forward, not with grief, not anymore, but with something like acknowledgement, like asking permission from the past before stepping toward the future. He thought Ellen would have had strong opinions about a man who spent 3 years mooning after his neighbor from a distance, instead of simply doing something sensible about it. Ellen had always had strong opinions and had expressed them freely, and he missed that about her with a specific and gentle ache that would probably be with him always, and that he had, at some point in the last 7 years, made his peace with. He opened his gate and went inside and put his supplies away, and he took the ribbon out of his pocket and set it on the kitchen table and looked at it, and then he picked it up and went next door and knocked. Minnie answered. She was wearing her apron and had flour on her hands and looked surprised to see him in a way that was immediately followed by something that was not surprise at all. "I was in town," he said, and held out the ribbon. She looked at it. He looked at her. The flour on her hands, the warmth from the kitchen coming past her shoulder, the ribbon blue as the October sky in his hand between them. "It is a very nice ribbon," she said carefully. "I thought so too," he said. She took it. Their fingers touched briefly in the exchange, and neither of them moved immediately, and then she smiled, not the polite smile she used on most people, the one she employed when being neighborly and sensible and all the other things she was so reliable about being, but a real one, private and warm, the kind that reached her eyes and did something irreversible to his composure. "Come in," she said. "I am making bread." He came in and sat at her kitchen table. It was becoming familiar, that chair, the way it faced the window that looked out toward the creek and watched her work, and they talked. Not about anything of particular consequence. She told him about a book she had been reading, a novel her friend Mrs. Aldrich had lent her, and he told her about a problem he had been having with one of his fields, a drainage issue that had plagued him since the spring, and she had a practical suggestion about it that surprised him and that he realized, upon reflection, should not have surprised him at all. "How do you know about field drainage?" he asked. "Robert's family were farmers," she said, punching the bread dough with a practiced rhythm. "I grew up hearing about nothing else at family dinners. His father would have talked about soil composition from sunup to sundown if anyone had let him. By the time Robert and I had been married 2 years, I could have written a pamphlet on the subject." "You must miss him," Cyrus said, and was not entirely sure why he said it except that honesty had started to feel like the right policy. She was quiet for a moment, working the dough. "I miss what we had," she said finally. "I miss the shape of it, the partnership, the companionship, the having of someone. Robert himself," she paused carefully, "Robert himself I have grieved properly and set to rest. I know that sounds strange." "It does not sound strange," he said. "It sounds like something that takes a long time to arrive at." She glanced at him over her shoulder. "Yes," she said quietly, "it does." He walked home that evening in the early dark, the stars just beginning to appear over the flat Kansas horizon, and he thought that it had been a long time since an ordinary day had felt so full. The first snow came in November. It arrived overnight on a Tuesday, light and tentative, barely an inch, but enough to transform the landscape into something simple and clean and entirely beautiful in the early morning light. Cyrus stood on his porch with his coffee and looked at the world gone white and saw the light on in Minnie's kitchen and saw her come out onto her porch a moment later with her own coffee, and they stood there on their respective porches 30 feet apart looking at the snow. "Beautiful," she called across. "It is," he called back. "Come look at it from over here," she said. "You can see the creek better from this side." He walked across the snow-covered ground between their gates, leaving the first tracks of the morning, and stood beside her on her porch and looked at the creek, which was frozen at the edges and running dark and quick in the center, and the cottonwoods along it with their bare branches holding small, precise amounts of snow. It was beautiful from her side. He was also aware that she was standing close enough that he could feel the warmth of her in the cold morning air. "I love the first snow," she said. "It always feels like a beginning rather than an ending." "Most people say it feels like an ending," he said. "The end of the season." "Most people are looking at it wrong," she said, with the easy certainty of someone who has thought about this and arrived at a satisfying conclusion. He turned to look at her profile, the straight line of her nose, the curve of her mouth with something small and pleased in it, the brown hair pulled back loosely under her shawl, and he thought, "I have been looking at it wrong for 3 years." He thought it plainly and without particular drama, the way a man arrives at a clear understanding of something he has been making complicated. "Minnie," he said. She turned to look at him, and whatever she saw in his expression made her go still, with that quality of careful attention she brought to things that mattered. "I would like to court you," he said, "if that is agreeable to you, properly, with your permission and Clara's." The silence that followed was not long, a few seconds at most, but it was dense with something. He watched the thoughts move through her face with a transparency that she was possibly not aware of. Surprise first, though not really surprise, then something that looked very like relief, and then the smile, the real one, the private, warm one. "It is agreeable to me," she said. "And Clara?" "Clara," Minnie said, "set an extra bowl of soup on the table the second time you came for lunch. I think Clara's opinion is already established." He laughed. It came out of him without preparation, an actual laugh, and he could not remember the last time he had done that, laughed without thinking about it first. She laughed too, a light, bright sound in the cold morning air, and they stood together on her porch looking at the snow-covered world and drinking their coffee, and the day felt larger and more possible than any day had felt in a very long time. He courted her with the same deliberate quality he brought to everything, not with elaborate gestures, but with presence and consistency and small attentions that accumulated into something considerable. He came to Sunday dinner reliably. He took her to the church social in November, and to the winter dance at the town hall in December, where he discovered that he had forgotten how to dance, and she was not a particularly accomplished dancer either, and they laughed at each other's expense throughout a polka, and it was the most fun either of them had had at a social event in years. He brought her books when he was in town. He had asked Pete Harwick's wife, who was an avid reader, for recommendations, a conversation that had clearly made Mrs. Harwick's month. He asked her about her mending business, and she told him about her clients and her ambitions to expand slightly, perhaps to take on some custom dressmaking if she could acquire a proper dress form, and he listened with the complete attention of a man who is genuinely interested in what a woman has to say. Clara observed all of this with approval. She began to include Cyrus in dinner conversations as a matter of course, consulting him on the topics that interested her: the political situation in Washington, the situation of the native peoples on the reservations, the question of women's suffrage, which was a subject about which she had extremely developed views, and he engaged with these topics seriously, without condescension, which elevated him considerably in her estimation. "He is not like most men," Clara told her mother one evening while they were washing up after dinner. "What do you mean?" Minnie asked. "Most men want a woman to agree with them," Clara said, with the precise observation of a 14-year-old who has been studying the world carefully. "Mr. Doyle wants you to have opinions. You can see it. When you say something he thinks is interesting, he looks satisfied, like he is glad you said it." Minnie kept her attention on the dish she was drying, but she was aware of a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the stove. "You like him," Clara said. It was not a question. "Yes," Minnie said simply. "Good," Clara said, and handed her the next dish with the air of someone whose work was proceeding according to plan. Christmas came. It was a good Christmas, the best in some respects that either of them had had in years. Cyrus came for Christmas dinner and brought a toy he had made for Clara, a small articulated wooden bird that could flap its wings when you pulled a string. And Clara, who was 14 and considered herself too old for toys, was delighted with it and could not stop demonstrating it to the cat. He and Minnie sat by the fire after Clara went to bed and talked quietly for a long time about nothing in particular and everything in general, and at some point he reached over and took her hand and she did not pull it back, and they sat like that in the firelight, his hand warm around hers and the winter pressed against the windows of her little house. "I have been thinking," he said eventually. "About what?" she asked. "About what I want," he said. He looked at their joined hands. "Which is not something I have spent much time thinking about in recent years." "And what do you want?" she asked, with the careful steadiness of a woman who has decided to be brave about things. He looked at her. "This," he said, "what this is." "And what is this?" she asked, and there was a warmth in her voice that made the question light rather than searching. "Something I do not want to stop," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder just slightly, just enough, and he stayed very still, the way a man stays still when he has been given something he was not sure he was going to be given and he does not want to disturb it. "Neither do I," she said. January in Kansas was cold in a way that made the autumn seem like a fevered dream of warmth and color. The temperature dropped and the wind came across the flat land with nothing to stop it, and the snow that fell was not the gentle tentative snow of November, but something meaner, driven sideways, accumulating in hard drifts against every fence and building. Cyrus moved his firewood supply to the side of his house nearest her fence, so that if she needed more during a bad stretch she could access it easily. She brought him a flannel-lined pair of work gloves she had made herself, stitching them in the evenings when Clara was doing her schoolwork, and he wore them every day from that point forward, and she saw them on his hands and thought something about that was very satisfying. In February, a problem arrived. His name was Dale Comstock, and he was a land speculator, which was a profession that in 1882 covered a considerable range of activities from the entirely legitimate to the outright predatory. Comstock had been through Caldwell 3 times in the past 2 years, always moving on quickly, but this time he seemed to have found something worth staying for. The something appeared to be the row of homesteads along the creek road, which he had apparently calculated were sitting on a position that would be very valuable to the railroad companies that were expanding aggressively through Kansas at that time. He began with the homestead at the east end of the road. An old man named Ferris who had been farming that land for 15 years and who sold at a price that was decent but not generous. Because Comstock was charming and the conversation had moved quickly, and old Ferris had not thought to consult anyone before the papers were signed. Then Comstock came to the middle of the road, where the Bauer family had a large garden operation and a small dairy, and the conversation there went longer because Mrs. Bauer was not easily charmed. In the end, the Bauers also sold, though Mrs. Bauer spent 6 months afterward expressing her regret. Then Comstock came to Minnie Harper's gate on a cold Tuesday morning in February and knocked. Minnie let him in because she was raised to be hospitable, and because she was curious, and she sat across from him at her kitchen table and listened to him explain that he represented certain business interests who were very eager to acquire properties in this particular area, and that he was prepared to offer her a very fair price. He named a figure, and that the offer was available for a limited time. The figure he named was not enough. It was not enough by a considerable margin to allow her to replicate what she had here: the house, the garden, the proximity to Clara's school, the established customer base for her mending work. She did not say this immediately. She thanked him for coming and told him she would think about it, and after he left she went to the window and looked out at her garden, frozen and still under the February sky, and felt something cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. She went next door and knocked on Cyrus's door. He answered and looked at her face and said, "What happened?" She told him about Comstock. She told him the figure. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "He will come to me next." "He may already have come to others on the road," she said. "Ferris sold," he said, "and the Bowers, I heard that last week." "I did not know," she said. She wrapped her hands around her elbows, standing in his doorway in her winter coat. "Cyrus, I cannot sell for that figure. I cannot replicate what I have here for that amount. And Clara's school, you are not selling," he said. It came out flatly, with a certainty that had nothing aggressive in it, simply the tone of a man stating a settled fact. She looked at him. "It is my property," she said carefully. "I am the one who decides." "Yes," he said immediately, understanding the distinction. "I am sorry. What I mean is you should not sell, and I do not think you need to. There are legal protections for homestead properties, and if he applies pressure beyond what is proper, there is the marshal's office and there is also a lawyer in Caldwell who knows his business. I am saying that you have options and you do not need to let him rush you." She considered this. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly. "Would you come with me to speak to the lawyer?" "Today if you want," he said, and turned to get his coat. They went to see Aldous Webb, the lawyer who had an office above the dry goods store, that same afternoon. Webb was a thin man of 50 with spectacles and a precise manner who listened to Minnie's account with focused attention and confirmed everything Cyrus had said. Her homestead claim was solid. Comstock could not compel a sale. And if Comstock attempted intimidation tactics of any kind, there were legal remedies available. Webb also mentioned, with some dryness, that Dale Comstock was a man he had encountered professionally before, and that his reputation for sharp dealing was well established. "He will not stop after one refusal," Webb said. "Men like Comstock are persistent, but persistence is not the same as power. Keep a written record of every contact he makes with you, every offer, every conversation. Come to me if anything feels wrong." On the way back, they walked together along the main street of Caldwell in the February cold, their breath visible in the air, and Minnie said, "Thank you for coming with me." "You did not need me there," he said. "You were entirely capable of that conversation without me." "I know," she said, "but it is different having someone beside you." He looked at her. The winter light made everything very clear and specific, the particular colors of things without any softening, and she was looking straight ahead with a determined lift to her chin, and he thought that she was possibly the most genuinely brave person he knew. "Yes," he said, "it is different." Comstock came back twice more. The second time he raised his offer, which confirmed Webb's assessment that the first offer had not been in good faith. The third time he came while Minnie was alone, and his manner was less charming, edged with an impatience that she did not like, and she shut the door in his face and went immediately to write it down in the journal she was keeping for Webb. When she told Cyrus about the third visit, something moved across his face that she had not seen there before, a cold, quiet anger, controlled but unmistakable. "Did he threaten you?" Cyrus asked. "Not in so many words," she said, "but his manner was unpleasant." He was quiet for a moment. "I am going to go speak to Marshal Bridger," he said. "You do not?" "I would like to," he said, "if you permit it." She looked at him for a moment, this man whose first instinct was to protect things and who had the sense to ask permission before doing it. "All right," she said. He went to speak to Marshal Bridger, who was a competent man and no friend of speculators, and Bridger in turn had a conversation with Comstock that apparently contained enough clarity about what Caldwell's law enforcement would and would not tolerate that Comstock found reason to move on from the area within the week. He did not come back. Minnie's homestead remained hers, solid and permanent as it had ever been. The experience had shaken her less than it might have, she realized, because she had not been facing it alone. The recognition of this was so specific and so significant that she sat with it for a day before she knew what to name it. She named it gratitude because it was that, but she also knew it was more than that. The first week of March arrived with a warm wind from the south that smelled of possible spring, and Cyrus came over on Saturday morning ostensibly to look at her garden preparation, and ended up staying for the better part of the day. They dug over the kitchen garden bed together, side by side with their spades, and the turned earth was dark and rich and smelled of everything waiting. Clara came out and dug with them for a while, and then left to visit her school friend Anna Breckett, and the afternoon grew warm and still and golden. They stopped working and sat on the porch steps in the warm March sun, and Minnie had her hair down, loose over her shoulders, because it was Saturday and she was at home, and she had not expected company when she started the morning, and she was not self-conscious about it. She was leaning slightly against his arm, and his arm was warm and solid, and she thought that this, too, was something she had been missing without knowing she was missing it. The simple, uncomplicated physical fact of being beside someone. "Tell me something you have not told anyone else," she said, because the afternoon had that quality of safety that makes honesty easy. He thought for a moment. "When I first came to Kansas," he said, "I almost left again after a week. The flatness of it. I grew up in Pennsylvania, hills everywhere. I came here in the flatness. I thought it would drive me mad. But it did not," she said. "I learned to see it differently," he said. "The sky is enormous here. You cannot see it the same way in Pennsylvania because the hills interrupt it. Here it is all sky. I came to prefer that, the scale of it." She nodded slowly. "I understand that. I felt the same at first. Now I feel hemmed in, almost, if I am somewhere with too many hills, as though something is blocking my view." He smiled at that, the slight particular smile she had come to know well. "Your turn," he said. "My turn," she said, and thought. "I'm afraid of becoming ordinary," she said, "of all the days becoming the same and not noticing until they are already gone." "Is that why you came west?" he asked. "After Robert died?" "Partly," she said. "It seemed like the sort of place where the days were less likely to be ordinary without your permission." "And have they been?" he asked. "Ordinary," she looked at him. He was looking at the garden, the turned dark earth, the late afternoon light on it. "Not this winter," she said. He looked at her then, and what was in his face was clear and warm and not careful at all. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had taken it at Christmas, and held it. They sat like that in the March sun on her porch steps while the warm wind moved through the bare branches of the cottonwoods along the creek, and the world felt neither ordinary nor complicated, but simply very right. Spring came in with considerable purpose that year, the land going from brown to green almost faster than the eye could follow. Minnie's kitchen garden began to produce in earnest by May, and she found herself bringing things over to Cyrus's house: early lettuce, radishes, the first herbs, and he received them with a directness of gratitude that never had any performance in it, which she liked very much. He had been working on something in his barn for weeks and would not tell her what it was, which she found mildly maddening and which Clara found extremely interesting. When he finally showed them in mid-May, it was a dress form, a proper adjustable one, made of wood and padded leather, exactly calibrated to Minnie's measurements. He had measured the dimensions based on a dress he had borrowed from the peg by her door under the pretense of checking the porch, a subterfuge that was so transparently absurd that when he confessed it she laughed for a long time. "You measured my dress by hand," she said. "It was the only information I had," he said with immense dignity. "You could have asked me. Then it would not have been a surprise." She stood looking at the dress form for a moment and felt something large and warm move through her that had no name adequate to it. It was precisely what she had wanted for her dressmaking work. It was the kind of attention to what another person needed and wanted that could not be manufactured, that had to come from genuine, sustained interest in the actual specifics of someone's life. "Cyrus," she said. "It may need adjustment," he said quickly. "If the measurements are not quite right, Cyrus," she said again, and he stopped talking and looked at her. She crossed the barn floor and stood in front of him and looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. And then she said, "I love you." She had not planned to say it at that exact moment. It had simply been true and present, and she had said it, because she had established long ago that honesty was the right policy, and because 3 years of waiting and 1 winter of courting had arrived, by the light of a spring afternoon in a barn, at a truth that was no longer deniable. His expression did something complicated. She watched it move through several things in quick succession: surprise, something that looked very like relief, and then something that was entirely without complexity, plain and clear and warm. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you for—" He stopped, something wry moving into the corner of his mouth. "I have probably loved you for considerably longer than I was prepared to admit." 3 years, she said. "I am not going to confirm that," he said. "It reflects poorly on my good sense." She laughed and he laughed, and she put her hand on his chest and felt his heartbeat, quick and real, and he put his hands on her face and kissed her for the first time, there in the barn in the May afternoon, with the smell of new wood and warm straw around them, and the sound of the creek running, and the birds going about their very loud spring business outside. It was a very good kiss. It was the kind of kiss that has a long history behind it and a long future ahead of it, and both of them knew it. And when they finally separated, they stood close together in the warm, dusty air, and he kept his hands on her face and looked at her as though he was making sure she was real. "Yes," she said, answering the question he had not asked. "I am still here." He made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a long, released breath. He asked her to marry him on a June evening when Clara was home, because he had understood from the beginning that whatever happened between himself and Minnie was also something that involved Clara, and he had wanted her present when he asked. He had spoken to Clara privately the week before and asked for her blessing, which had prompted Clara to say, in the exact tone of a person who has been waiting for an adult to arrive at an obvious conclusion, "I gave you my blessing when I set the soup bowl out last October, Mr. Doyle." I assumed that was clear. He had found this enormously endearing. He produced a ring he had bought in Wichita on a supply run the previous week. A simple gold band with a small pearl set in it, not extravagant but beautiful. And he asked Minnie, with Clara sitting at the kitchen table watching with her arms folded, and a look of absolute satisfaction on her face, whether she would do him the considerable honor of marrying him. Minnie looked at the ring and at him and at Clara and back at him, and she said yes without any hesitation whatsoever, and Clara said, "Finally," and then everyone laughed. They were married in August of 1883 at the church that Minnie attended, with roughly half of Caldwell present because the town had been invested in this development for some time and felt a proprietary interest in its successful conclusion. Pete Harwick from the general store was there and cried openly, which he later attributed to a problem with dust. Mrs. Webb from the lawyer's office made a cake. Clara stood beside her mother as maid of honor with the blue ribbon Cyrus had brought home the previous October woven through her dark braids, because Minnie had saved it and Clara had found it and understood its significance perfectly. The ceremony was simple and the vows were the traditional ones, but when Cyrus looked at Minnie and said, "I do," it contained 3 years of careful distance and 1 winter of coffee and bread making, and snow and fence mending and hands held by the fire, and every single moment of it was audible if you were paying the right kind of attention. Minnie moved into his house, or rather, they reorganized both houses, keeping hers for her mending and dressmaking business, which expanded considerably once she had the dress form and the additional time that came with having a partner managing the larger property tasks. His house became theirs together, and the change it underwent in the weeks that followed was remarkable. It became warm in the way that inhabited places become warm when someone brings their full self into them. The herbs appeared on the ceiling beams. The drawings Clara's and some of Minnie's own, because it turned out she sketched. Another thing he had not known went up on the walls. The kitchen smelled of things cooking. The evenings had sound in them. He found that he had been not quite alive for 7 years and had not recognized the condition because he had been functioning perfectly well. And because the thing you are missing is difficult to identify when you have never had it. And then it had arrived, slowly and consistently over the course of one autumn and winter and spring and summer, and now it was simply present, as permanent as the house around them, and he could not quite fathom that he had spent 3 years studiously avoiding it. Clara adapted to the new arrangement with a smoothness that suggested she had been rehearsing it in her mind for some time. She called him Mr. Doyle for several months longer, which was fine. He did not press it. In January, after a particularly difficult day at school involving a mathematics examination and the subsequent discovery that Anna Breckett had cheated on it while Clara had not, and the consequent unfairness of their equal scores, she came home in a state of considerable righteous outrage and was debating the situation at the dinner table, and in the middle of a sentence said, "And Cyrus, you agree with me, don't you?" and then stopped, looking at him. He said calmly that he did agree, that academic integrity was a matter of principle, and that she was right to feel the unfairness of it. And he also said that Anna Breckett would face the consequences of her choices in her own time, and that Clara's conscience was the cleaner of the two, which was ultimately more valuable than a score on a mathematics examination. Clara looked at him for a moment with an expression that was trying to be 14-year-old dignity and was actually something much more vulnerable than that, and then she said, "Thank you, Cyrus." He looked at his plate so she would not see his expression. He felt Minnie's foot find his under the table and press against it gently, and he pressed back. In November of 1883, Minnie told him she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning after Clara had gone to school, and she told him with the particular combination of wonder and uncertainty that attends this kind of news when you are 32 years old and not expecting it, and when the happiness of it is entangled with the awareness of everything that can go wrong. He knew what he was supposed to feel about this. He knew what he was supposed to say. And he also knew what he actually felt, which was a complex country composed of equal parts joy and terror, because the last time this had happened it had taken 2 people from him, and knowing intellectually that this was a different time and a different woman, and that most pregnancies did not end in tragedy, was not the same as feeling that in the chest where the old grief still had a small permanent room. He sat down in the kitchen chair and was quiet for long enough that Minnie's expression shifted. "I am not unhappy," he said immediately. "Please understand that I am not unhappy." She came and sat beside him and put her hand over his. "I know about Ellen," she said. "I know." He looked at their joined hands. "I am afraid," he admitted, and saying it cost him something that came from a depth he usually did not access in conversation. "I am afraid too," she said. "But I am also, Cyrus, I am so happy. Can both of those things exist at the same time?" "Yes," he said, and put his arm around her and held her against his side. "Yes, both of those things can exist." They held on to each other for a while in the November morning, and then he said very quietly, "I am going to be here for every part of it. I am not going anywhere." "I know that," she said. "I have always known that about you." He looked at her. "Have you?" "From the very first day," she said. "That is partly what took me so long to work up the courage to knock on your door." He considered this. "Because you knew I would stay. Because I knew that if I knocked, everything would change," she said simply. "And I was not sure I was ready for everything to change, but the pie tin helped." "The pie tin," he said. "It was a very good excuse," she said. "Clara made a very good pie." He smiled at that. "Yes," he said, "she did." The pregnancy progressed well. Minnie was healthy and capable and sensible about all of it, consulting the doctor, a careful, competent man named Dr. Paul Reeves, who had been in Caldwell for 6 years, and in whom Cyrus had developed confidence regularly, and following his guidance without drama. She continued her dressmaking through the winter, sitting at her work table in the warm house with her needle moving and her belly growing, and she was beautiful in a way that caught him off guard repeatedly throughout those months, the warm, specific beauty of a person who is entirely inhabiting their life. Clara turned 15 in February, and was given a subscription to a magazine for young women that contained articles about education and literature and current events, a gift from both Cyrus and her mother, and she received it with more enthusiasm than she had received anything since the articulated wooden bird of Christmas 1882. She was studying harder than ever, focused now on the genuine possibility of attending a teacher's college, a conversation they had all had together at the dinner table, and which Cyrus had supported with the same matter-of-fact seriousness that he brought to all of Clara's ambitions, because he had understood from the beginning that this girl was going somewhere, and the appropriate response to that was encouragement rather than doubt. The baby came in June. He was born early on a Wednesday morning, healthy and indignant about his situation, as babies generally are. Dr. Reeves was in attendance, and so was the midwife, a formidable woman named Mrs. Prout, who had brought approximately 300 babies into the world, and who projected such utter competence that simply being in the same room as her made the impossible seem possible. Cyrus sat outside the bedroom door for most of the night, moving between the porch and the kitchen, making coffee he did not drink, listening to the sounds from inside with the particular alert stillness of a man who is managing a very serious fear through sheer force of attention. When Mrs. Prout opened the door and said, "Mr. Doyle, your wife would like to see you," he was in through the door before she had finished the sentence. Minnie was exhausted and radiant in the specific way of women who have done something enormous and know it, propped up against the pillows, and she held up the baby for him to see. The baby was very small and very red and had, somehow, already produced an expression of considerable skepticism about the world in general. "A boy," Minnie said. "He is healthy. He is perfect." Cyrus sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and felt something break open in his chest, something that had been sealed there for 7 years. Since the morning he had sat alone in a cold room in Colorado with 2 small graves between him and any possible future. It broke open not with grief but with something so large and warm it did not quite have a name, and he was not entirely surprised to find that his face was wet. "Cyrus," Minnie said softly. "He is perfect," he agreed, voice rough. He reached out and touched the baby's face very carefully with one finger, and the baby's expression shifted from skepticism to something more evaluative. "Hello," he said, because it seemed like the right thing to say. They named him James after Minnie's father. Clara came in 20 minutes later, looked at the baby with enormous eyes, and declared that he was the best thing that had ever happened, and also that she was going to be an excellent elder sister, a position she took up immediately and occupied with characteristic thoroughness. The summer of 1884 was warm and full. James grew with the healthy relentlessness of babies, and their house was full of him. His sounds, his needs, his discoveries, his laughter, which appeared at around 3 months and was so surprising and perfect that every instance of it produced genuine delight in every member of the household. Cyrus moved through those months with something that he gradually identified as happiness, not the conditional, precarious happiness of a person waiting for the other shoe to drop, but something more durable than that, something established. He still had the room in his chest where grief had lived. He thought he always would. He had room in his chest for Ellen and the unnamed child, and the young man he had been before he knew that kind of loss. And that room was quiet and no longer painful, and in some way felt like the foundation upon which everything else had been built. You needed the sorrow to know the depth of the joy. He had understood this intellectually for years, and now he understood it in his bones. He worked his land and maintained both properties, and helped Minnie with her dressmaking customers when she needed heavy items moved or shelves adjusted, and watched his daughter. She was his daughter. Clara was his. She had decided this in her own time and her own way, and he had not hurried it, grow more certain of herself and more brilliant with every passing month. He sat on his porch in the evenings with Minnie beside him, and watched the Kansas sky do what it did in the evenings, which was to produce colors that seemed excessive and that were, nonetheless, entirely real. "Do you ever think," Minnie said to him one evening in September with James asleep on her shoulder and the sky going every shade of orange and gold and pink over the flat horizon, "about how close we came to missing all of this?" "Every day," he said. "The pie tin," she said and smiled. "The pie tin," he agreed. "And Clara," she said. "Clara brought you the pie." "Clara had good instincts from the beginning," he said. "She gets it from me," Minnie said with a serenity that made him laugh. Clara came to them at the end of that autumn with a letter from a teacher's college in Topeka, which had a program for young women seeking teaching certificates, and which was accepting applications for the following year. She stood in the kitchen doorway with the letter in both hands and looked at them with something in her face that was hopeful and also braced, in the way of a young person who wants something very much and is not certain how the wanting of it will be received. "Show me," Minnie said, and Clara brought the letter, and they read it together at the kitchen table, all three of them, with James in his cradle by the stove. "This is a very good program," Cyrus said, reading the requirements. "The curriculum is serious." "I know," Clara said. "That is why I want to go." "We will need to look at the finances," Minnie said with the practical candor that characterized her approach to all important questions. "But that is not a no, Clara, that is a let's figure it out." Clara looked at her mother. She looked at Cyrus. Something in her face, the braced quality, dissolved. "I can work over the summer," she said. "Mrs. Harwick mentioned she could use help at the store, and I am a good worker." "You are an exceptional worker," Cyrus said. "And yes, that would help. And I expect the program offers some scholarship options that are worth investigating." He looked at Minnie. "Webb might know something about that. Educational endowments." Minnie nodded. "We will go see him this week." Clara sat down in the kitchen chair with the letter in her lap and breathed carefully, the controlled breath of someone who is trying very hard not to cry because she was 15 and thought crying was undignified. "Thank you," she said. The two words carried everything in them, not just gratitude for this specific conversation, but a larger acknowledgement of the family that had assembled itself around her through the particular accident of a pie tin and a December snowfall, and a man who had stood in a doorway too long. "You are going to make an extraordinary teacher," Cyrus said simply. "The question is not whether you should go. The question is only how we make it work." That night, after Clara was in bed and James was asleep, and the house was quiet, Minnie sat beside Cyrus in their sitting room with her feet tucked under her and her head on his shoulder and said, "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" "The pie tin," said. She laughed softly. "Besides the pie tin, I think about how you stood in the doorway that first morning when I came to return it. You stood there for such a long time." "I was deciding something," he said. "What were you deciding?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the September dark, and the creek ran quiet along its banks, and the cottonwood trees, whose leaves had gone golden again, stood along the water in the familiar way of things that have been in their place for a long time. "Whether I was going to keep being afraid," he said, "or whether I was going to let you in." She lifted her head and looked at him. "And I let you in," he said, "for coffee." "You did not come in for coffee," she pointed out. "I brought the coffee to you." "Details," he said. She put her hand on his chest over his heart and felt it beat steady and sure under her palm. "You have never been a coward," she said. "You took longer than necessary, but you were never a coward." 3 years is considerably longer than necessary," he said. "The timing was right," she said. "We were both ready." He covered her hand with his and held it there, and they sat in the warm quiet of their house, while the autumn wind moved through Caldwell, Kansas, on a September evening in 1884, and everything around them was settled and real and good. The following spring, Clara was accepted to the Teachers' College in Topeka. The letter came on a Thursday morning in April, and Clara held it for a full 2 minutes before she opened it, standing in the kitchen with Minnie and Cyrus watching her with the specific contained anticipation of two people trying not to put their own feelings on the moment. Then she opened it and read the first sentence, and her face went through something extraordinary, surprise and joy and relief all at once, like a sunrise moving across a landscape. And she put the letter down on the table and said nothing for a moment, which was so unlike Clara that both of them understood the depth of what she was feeling. "Well," Minnie said, unable to help herself. "I am going to Topeka," Clara said, and then she did cry, which she had decided at 15 was undignified and had now, at 16, revised to acceptable under specific circumstances. And Minnie put her arms around her daughter and held her while James, who was nearly a year old and had views about loud emotions, looked on from his position on Cyrus's hip with considerable interest. Cyrus stood in the kitchen doorway looking at his wife holding their daughter and his son's small warm weight against his side, and felt the fullness of it, the complete, settled fullness of a life that had been built slowly and intentionally from the materials that grief and time and one returned pie tin had provided. He thought about the day Minnie Harper had first arrived in the wagon, and he had looked at her for one unguarded second, and had then spent 3 years being an extremely thorough fool about it. He thought about the way the doorway had felt that October morning when she knocked and held out the tin, how he had stood there in some paralysis of recognition, while the autumn wind sent cottonwood leaves spinning past his fence. He thought about the coffee, the bandaged hand, the blue ribbon, the first snow, the dress form in the barn, the ring with the small pearl, the August wedding with half of Caldwell in attendance, and James's indignant arrival into the world on a June morning, and Clara saying Cyrus at the dinner table as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "All right over there?" Minnie asked, looking at him over Clara's shoulder. "Yes," he said. "Better than all right." James reached out and grabbed a handful of Cyrus's collar and held on, as he liked to do, with the absolute confidence of a small person who has never had reason to doubt that the person holding him would hold him. Summer came again. Clara prepared for Topeka through June and July, and the house was full of the particular organized chaos of someone who is packing up a life and beginning a new one. Cyrus helped her build a small storage trunk for her things, working with her in the barn on a series of Saturday mornings, while she told him about everything she intended to study and everything she intended to do, and every idea she had already developed about how she would organize her future classroom. And he listened to all of it with the patient pleasure of a man who has unlimited time for the things that matter. She left for Topeka on the 3rd of August, on the morning stage. They saw her off at the stage office, Minnie and Cyrus and James on Cyrus's hip, and Clara stood with her trunk beside her and looked at them with those enormous dark eyes that had been studying the world so carefully since the first time Cyrus had seen them over a bowl of soup at this kitchen table. "I will write every week," she said. "James, you had better be saying proper words by Christmas." James said "bah," which he meant as something affirmative. "Good," Clara said. She looked at Cyrus. She hesitated for exactly 1 second, and then she stepped forward and hugged him, which she had not done before, had worked up to it, had been working up to it, and had apparently decided that the morning of departure was the time. He held on, one arm around her and James in the crook of the other, and he thought about the 14-year-old who had set an extra soup bowl on the table and organized the entire situation through sheer force of patient will. "Take care of her," Clara said into his shoulder, meaning her mother. "Always," he said. She pulled back and smoothed her coat and picked up her travel bag and turned to Minnie, who had been crying in a dignified and controlled way for the last several minutes. They held each other for a long moment. Then the stage driver called the all aboard and Clara stepped up and the door closed, and the stage rolled away down the main street of Caldwell in the early morning sun, and they watched it until it was out of sight. Minnie stood beside him on the boardwalk, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and James put a small hand on her face as if in sympathy, which made her laugh through the tears. "She is going to do everything she said she is going to do," Cyrus said. "I know," Minnie said. "That is partly what I am crying about. The other part is that she is grown and going, and I am not entirely sure I know how to be the mother of someone who is grown and going." "You will figure it out," he said. "You figure everything out." She looked up at him. "Is that your professional assessment?" "It is my 3-year observation," he said. plus 2 additional years of very close proximity. She wiped her eyes and straightened up and took a breath, the particular breath of a woman who has felt something fully and is now returning to the business of life, which continues regardless. "Breakfast," she said. "James has been indicating strong feelings on the subject for the last 20 minutes, he said. "Yes," she said, looking at her son. "He has opinions about mealtimes. I wonder where he gets that." James said "bah" again with emphasis. "Quite right," Cyrus told him gravely. They walked home through Caldwell on the August morning, his arm around her and James on his hip, and the summer day opening up around them. Past Pete Harwick's general store, and the lawyer's office, and the church, and the school where Clara had spent her days becoming who she already was, and the houses and the boardwalks and the familiar smell of a Kansas summer morning, and they came to the creek road and walked along it to their gate and went in. The house was theirs, warm and inhabited and entirely full of the particular quality of a place where people have been genuinely happy. The herbs on the ceiling beams, the drawings on the walls, the dress form by the window of the workroom, the small new pieces of furniture that had accumulated over 2 years of marriage, each with a story. The cradle in the corner of the bedroom that was too small for James now, replaced by a proper crib, but that Minnie had kept because it was the first piece of furniture he had ever inhabited, and she was not ready to part with it yet. He made the coffee, while Minnie settled James into his high chair, a contraption of Cyrus's own construction that James regarded with some suspicion, but had been persuaded to accept, and cut bread and sliced the preserves, and brought it all to the table, and they sat down together in the August morning to their ordinary, extraordinary day. The years continued to layer themselves, one on another, the way the seasons always did, each one distinct and each one building on what came before. Clara sent letters from Topeka that were dense with observation and opinion and affection, and eventually she sent a letter announcing that she had met a young man named Franklin Eads who was studying law and who was, she wrote with characteristic clarity, extremely intelligent and also quite handsome, and that she intended them to meet him at Christmas, and that she expected them to be on their best behavior. Cyrus read this letter aloud at the dinner table, and he and Minnie agreed without discussion that they very much intended to be on their best behavior. And they were. And Franklin Eads turned out to be everything Clara had described, and he looked at Clara the way a man looks at someone he intends to make his life's work, which was the only thing Cyrus actually needed to know about him. James walked and talked and became his own person with the relentless speed of children, his father's gray eyes, and his mother's direct manner, and some quality entirely his own that expressed itself most often in the area of persistent mechanical curiosity. He wanted to know how everything worked and was not satisfied with approximate answers. By the time he was 3, he was taking apart the small wind-up toys he was given and putting them back together, usually successfully, which Cyrus found a source of unreasonable pride, and Minnie found a source of only slightly more reasonable anxiety about what he would graduate to once he ran out of toys. In the spring of 1887, Minnie told Cyrus she was pregnant again. She told him with more confidence this time, and with the same warm combination of joy and uncertainty, and this time he received it with less fear and more pure happiness, though the fear was still there at its small, permanent level, and he did not pretend otherwise. She arrived safely in October with a girl they named Ruth, who had Minnie's brown eyes and an expression of considerable serenity that was entirely unlike anyone else in the household. Clara came home for the birth. She had finished her first year of the teaching program and was back in Caldwell for the summer, and held Ruth with the careful reverence of an older sister handling something irreplaceable, and James inspected the baby with the analytical attention of a 4-year-old, who is unsure whether this development is net positive or net negative, and is reserving judgment pending further data. Cyrus held his daughter on the first evening after the birth, in the quiet of the house after the doctor and midwife had gone and James was asleep and Minnie was resting, and he sat in the chair by the window and looked at this small new person and thought about how the world continued to expand when you let it. He thought about the chair in his empty kitchen 7 years ago, and the man who had sat in it, sealed up and solitary and telling himself that the sealed quality was a choice. He thought about cottonwood leaves and blue ribbon and a pie tin and a doorway on an October morning, and the 30 feet of ground between two gates that had taken 3 years to cross and had contained, on the other side of it, everything. Ruth blinked at him with those calm brown eyes, decided he was acceptable, and went asleep on his chest. Minnie appeared in the doorway. She was not supposed to be out of bed, and she knew it and did not care, and leaned against the frame and looked at them, her husband and her daughter in the chair by the window with the lamplight warm around them. "Cyrus," she said softly. He looked up. "Are you happy?" she asked. He looked at the baby on his chest. He looked at his wife in the doorway. He thought of the house around them, full of their life, the sounds it held, the smells, the small specific textures of the days they had made together. "Yes," he said, "completely." She smiled, the real one, the private warm one, the one he had first seen on her porch in the October morning when he held out a length of blue ribbon and she took it from his hand, and that he had been seeing ever since in its 1,000 variations. Delighted, tender, amused, grateful, loving. She had been giving him that smile for 4 years of marriage and 3 years before it, and he was not tired of it and did not expect to become so. "Come back to bed," she said. "In a minute," he said, and looked again at his sleeping daughter. "Give me just 1 minute." She went back to bed, and he sat in the chair a little longer. In the warm lamplight of the house they had built together from the small, unlikely foundation of a pie tin and a bandaged hand and an October morning, when neither of them could think of a good enough reason to move away from the doorway. And he listened to the sound of Caldwell, Kansas settling into its October night around him. The creek running, the wind in the cottonwoods, the occasional distant sound of the town at its late business. And he thought that there was no part of this life, not a single hour of it, that he would exchange for the sealed safety of what came before. He settled Ruth more gently into her cradle, and she sighed the small sigh of someone entirely at home in the world, and he tucked the blanket around her and straightened up and looked out the window at the dark October sky, full of stars the way the Kansas sky was always full of stars, enormous and permanent above the flat land. Then he went to bed. Minnie was not quite asleep, and she turned toward him when he lay down, and he put his arm around her, and she settled against him with the ease of long habit, the ease of two people who have become entirely comfortable in each other's presence, who have nothing to perform and nothing to conceal and nothing left to be afraid of. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said. Outside, the cottonwood leaves turned on their branches in the night wind, golden and letting go, and the creek ran on in the dark between the banks it had inhabited long before any of them arrived, and the stars made their slow wheel across the Kansas sky, and inside the house on the creek road in Caldwell everything was warm and still and settled, the way things become when they have found their right place at last and mean to stay there. Clara married Franklin Eads the following June, in the same church in Caldwell where Cyrus and Minnie had married 3 years before. She stood at the altar in a dress that Minnie had made for her, the finest work of Minnie's considerable dressmaking career, a dress that Clara had cried over when she first saw it, which she described afterward as purely an optical response and not an emotional one at all, and which nobody believed and looked at Franklin with the full force of that direct, certain gaze, and said her vows in the clear, steady voice of a woman who has known her own mind since she was 14, and setting soup bowls on tables with strategic purpose. Cyrus walked her down the aisle because she had asked him to, using exactly the words she always used for things she wanted and was not entirely sure she had the right to want. A direct request, no hedging, watching his face carefully. He had said yes before she finished asking, and she had looked at him for a moment with those enormous dark eyes, and then looked away at the ceiling, which he had understood was her managing her feelings in the dignified manner she preferred. When the ceremony was over and the celebration was beginning in the church hall, with most of Caldwell in attendance as it had been for Cyrus and Minnie's wedding 3 years prior, he found himself standing beside Minnie watching Clara laugh at something Franklin said, her hand in his, the afternoon light coming through the windows and making everything golden. "We did something right," Minnie said. "Clara did most of it herself," he said. "She did," Minnie agreed. "But we made the conditions possible. That counts." He looked at his wife beside him, and at his son James, who was 5 years old and extraordinarily well dressed for the occasion and currently engaged in a conversation with Pete Harwick about the mechanical properties of the music box that was providing the background for the celebration, and at Ruth on Minnie's hip, looking at the room with her calm brown eyes, taking inventory. He looked at all of it, the full particular sum of this life. "Minnie," he said. She turned to look at him. "I should have knocked on your door years ago," he said. She raised her eyebrows. "Oh, you mean instead of me coming to return your pie tin?" "Clara's pie tin," he corrected. "You keep changing that story," she said. "My pie tin, I lent it, I returned it." "You did everything in that transaction," he said. "I just stood in the doorway." "You stood there for a very long time," she said. "I was deciding something important." "And you decided right," she said. "Yes," he said. "Eventually." She laughed, the light, bright sound of it in the warm afternoon in the full church hall with the music and the celebration around them, and he thought, there it is. There is the thing. The thing he had been afraid of for 3 years and had been given and given and given again, in every possible variation. And that was still, after all this time, entirely sufficient to make the whole world feel like exactly the right size. He took her hand, there in the church hall on the afternoon of their daughter's wedding, and she squeezed his fingers, and they stood together watching the room full of people they loved, in the town they had made their home, in the life they had built from scratch and stubbornness, and one autumn morning when neither of them had moved away from a doorway when perhaps they should have. Ruth reached out from Minnie's hip and grabbed a fistful of Cyrus's sleeve, as she did, as James had done before her, with the absolute assurance of a small person who has never had any reason to doubt the permanence of the person beside her. He took her hand too, that small, steady grip, and held it. And that was it. That was all of it. That was everything.